If you were to look at my childhood through modern eyes, you probably say that was neglect. You might ring the social services and have someone come out and take charge of me. But I think it was one of the greatest opportunities of my lifetime and one of the greatest experiences of my lifetime, and I'm very thankful for it. A lot of Gen X kids from the 1970s, they all look back and say about the absolute freedom they had. They left home in the morning, didn't come home till the street lights came on at night. But my childhood had a bigger twist to it than that. Let's say an Oliver twist. I compare my childhood to that of Huckleberry Finn. At the age of 5, I moved to a remote village in Northern Ireland. It was my great-grandfather's farm built in the Victorian era, and it had never been updated since, and he was in his 90s at the time, and I got to experience the life of a Victorian child as if it was the 1870s. I might be looking back at it with nostalgia through rose-tinted glasses, but I think it was one of the greatest adventures of my life, and it really shaped me into the person that I am today. So, let me tell you my story of not just how I was a Gen X kid in the 1970s that had total liberty and freedom. I had complete liberty and freedom to run wild and feral as if I was from a different century. No electricity, no running water, an outside toilet, no amenities whatsoever. This isn't a story about deprivation. This is a story about freedom. A story of a childhood spent outdoors, connected and at one with nature, free from any of the pressures that shape modern childhoods. Gen X, were we the last completely free generation of kids? Feral, wild, kicked out after breakfast, told not to come back till it was dark? That just wasn't freedom. That was survival training. We could call the latchkey kids. Basically, you came home from school, let yourself in, went into an empty house, made your own food, take care of yourself. We were the last generation that worked it all out ourselves without the constant hand on the shoulder of an adult guiding us along. In some ways, we were forced to grow up before we were ready, with no choice in the matter. It was about surviving and finding our own way. But I think we really have missed something in the new generations. I'm not putting the new generations down, but I think we had a uniqueness about how we were brought up. There's good to it, there's bad to it, but I think it's something that we're never going to see again, and that's a very sad thing. Perhaps I'll start with my own story and sort of tie it into the wider Gen X. My story in some ways is a wee bit unique, maybe unique in the Western world, but not so elsewhere. But I was born in a small rural town in Northern Ireland, and for the first 5 years of my life, I lived in a council house in Terrace in the middle of a town. At 5 years old, my family moved out to my great-grandfather's house. Now, that was a farmhouse out in the country, and it was about 3 miles outside the main town. Now, to get to that house, they weren't even paved over. There were old stone laneways, grass up the middle. In Ireland, we'd call those a boreen. The house itself was a Victorian-era farmhouse, 2-storey farmhouse, wee porch on the front, wee porch on the back, wee farmyard around it, and a whole range of stables, bars and outhouses and things like that around it. The house itself, built in the mid-1800s, had been a renovation of a much older house. When you look at the house, the stone walls were literally about that thick. They were about 3 foot thick or more. There was big cornerstones inside, and underneath that you could actually see the house itself used to be sort of mud brick wattle type thing many years ago. So the house itself, the side of it, had been around for many centuries or generations. It was covered in like old-fashioned pebble dash, which literally just was pebbles from a beach pushed into cement. Now, it was my great-grandfather's house, and he was in his 90s, so he was a man born in the Victorian era and lived right up through, say, the 1920s. When we moved out there in the mid-1970s, he was about 90 years of age. Now, because it was a rural house, and this was sort of atypical for sort of remote rural areas in Northern Ireland at the time, electricity wasn't available. Electricity had made it to the town, obviously, that I was born into, and it had all the modern amenities. But in the rural areas, the electricity board, they used to charge people to bring the cabling out. And to get the cabling from the last house it was at to our house was about £6,000. Now, £6,000 back in the 1970s was a hell of a lot of money. And the way it usually worked, small rural villages like the one I grew up in, The people would have came together and they would have split that cost between them, and they would have brought it out from house to house, and they'd all had an equal share of it. Now, Northern Ireland being Northern Ireland in the 70s were a very hard time. There was a lot of political unrest, a civil war, the Troubles as we called it here. There was people from both sides of the community. There was a lot of religious differences, political differences, and people didn't always get on well with the neighbours. And trying to get everyone to come together and split the price, it just never happened. So family feuds, political feuds, religious feuds, whatever you want to call it, it literally kept that little house on that little road with other farms there, sort of in the Victorian era. The house itself probably hadn't been updated from the 1920s. Wooden sash windows went up and down with the little weights on the side, single glass glazing, inside was all wood panelling, absolutely no electricity, so no switches or anything on the wall like that. The light was from little oil tilly lamps. I used to love them. You used to prime them, start them. There was a wee cloth or cotton globe. It used to brighten up and then expand out into the light, and always had this little hissing noise while you were watching it, and you could smell the oil burning and things like that. So it's a memory that's stuck in my mind every time I smell something like that, because it used a certain type of fuel. I can't remember the name of it now, but it was quite unique, the smell of it. And it's something that stimulates memories of my childhood anytime I come across it. The house itself didn't really have a proper kitchen. They always in Ireland, we called them a scullery, or you could call it like a little pantry. It was a little small narrow area. Because there was no electricity, there was actually no running water as well, so we had the old-fashioned well outside, and you actually had to go out and pump it. Used to love doing that, and my God, that water tasted good because it was natural mineral water. And in those days, the groundwater was really, really clean, for it hadn't been polluted with all the modern septic tanks and oil spillages and everything else that goes along. So that water was really, really sweet. When I was small, I used to always hate the first pump because little earwigs would drop out and stuff, and you'd jump back. Then you'd put the bucket in once you had fresh water. You'd fill it up and bring it in. Because it was straight out of the ground, I think it was about 80 feet deep, the well. It was already lovely freezing cold. When you went into our pantry, there was like a little rack with little hooks, and all the little mugs used to hang along it. We'd pour the water into a big earthenware crock, because that was good at keeping it cool. You put a little wooden lid on the top of it. But I always used to love taking a cup full of water and drinking it. Always loved the water. It was just so good, and it's just something you can't get anymore. Modern bottled mineral waters that you buy, like Perrier or some of the big brands, they're not even a cup of what that was, the real McCoy, straight from the ground. So moving from a town that would have a modern house with all the modern amenities out to this old stone farmhouse that didn't have water or electricity, lights, anything like that at all, or a telephone, it was very remote. And you could say that could have been a big shock, but when you're 5 years old, you just get on with it. You know, you just don't know any different. It's just life and what it is. And to be honest, it gave me a really amazing childhood. In some ways, I grew up probably with a Victorian childhood rather than a modern childhood of the 1970s. But I still do have the memories of living in the town and sort of childhood in the 1970s as well. So I'm able to contrast the two sort of styles and draw comparisons between them. One of the big things I really noticed when I first went out, basically there was no bathrooms in the houses. Because there was no running water or electricity or anything like that. So we had an old stone outhouse. We had a different name for it, but we'll not repeat it on here. And as a child, you really, really had to be going to the toilet at night if you wanted to go out, because it was actually across the yard and into the first field. It was made of sort of like rough stone, a wee tin roof on it, an old creaky wooden door. There was ivy growing up the sides of it and little ferns growing out of the stones. And you went in and it was literally a wooden bench with a hole. Everything dropped through into a little pit at the back, and someone had to clean it out with a spade every now and then. Horrible job. Glad I was 5 years old and didn't have to do that. But honest to God, you see on a cold night, maybe it rain lashing off you, you having to run down there at night to go to the toilet. I'm telling you, that was tough. I always loved the living room sort of stroke kitchenette in the house, because it had one of those big old fashioned wooden tables. There was a Stanley range over at the side with the wee bar and the tea cloths hanging off it, and there was always a big kettle on the top. There was always hot water boiling, for you'd never know who was coming to the house for a cup of tea. In the real cold winter, I used to love standing against it, warm your backside on it. You put the wood inside it, closed up the doors and things like that there. It was absolutely amazing. I always have loved the Stanley range because of that. And it really did fill up the house full of heat, and before you went up to bed at night, you would open the door in the hallway and let some of the heat up the stairs. Now, in our kids' bedroom in winter, it was really, really cold because it just had single glazing. There was no real insulation or anything in the roof. It was just a Welsh slate roof. But at the end of the bed, literally about 2 feet away from the bed, there was wee small Victorian cast iron fireplaces, and we would put wood or turf onto those. So when you were a small kid in the middle of winter, you used to love pulling the quilt up. Well, it would have been blankets and patchwork quilts back then. You had multiple layers, but you'd have stuck your 2 feet out the bottom and you would have pointed them towards the fire, and you'd got the warmth of the fire on your feet. When you look back at it now, such a fire hazard. Small kids in a room with a fire there, bits spitting out of it everywhere. We could have been kicking the blankets off, messing about, carrying on. But look, multiple generations of the family grew up like that, and they all turned out all right, and they didn't burn the place down, and neither did we. In the mornings in the winter, you'd have looked out the windows and it would just have been all frosted over. You would have to breathe on it, literally rubbed a wee hole so you could look out. That's how cold it was. You'd lie in bed and you'd breathe out. You would see your breath turn to steam basically in the cold air. So you slept at night with the blankets up out over the top of you. And as a small kid, I would have been really scared in that bedroom because multiple generations had lived and died in there. When you're a small kid, you used to think about ghosts and who died in the bed you're in, all this sort of stuff. So it was really fascinating. I think it probably was toughest on my mother, and I must give her an awful lot of respect for what she put up with when she moved out to the farm. She had to come out of the town and would have been used to all the modern conveniences. She had 2 small children, and shortly afterwards 2 babies as well. And literally she was living in the Victorian era. She used to have to wash the clothes, and back in those days there was no disposable nappies or anything. It was the cloth terry nappies. She just had to steep them in a bucket, then wash them out, and then she had to wash them in a basin on the old-fashioned washboard, wring them out, and she'd got one of those machines that you put them in and you turn the handle and you wring the clothes out. That was tough, especially in cold weather. I remember her fingers would all have been hacked and things like that. I don't know how she raised 4 kids in those conditions, getting the water from the well, washing everything by hand, having to put them up on the line, or if it was a wet day, put them out in front of the stove or whatever to dry out. It was really tough going for her. Especially even things like bathing and looking after the kids. We used to bring in a big old tin bath, put it in front of the stove, and there was an open fire at the other side. And then you would get water from inside. The stove had a water tank, so you could get hot water from it, or you could boil the kettle and top it up. And you had to share the bath with your brother or whatever, and everybody took turns using the water because it was very limited. And you'd have been doing that on a dark evening with a wee tilly lamp burning away. But you know something, it was good fun. You splash about and mess about, and you just didn't know any different. But as old and run down as the house was, it had a real family history and family connection. Like if a wee picture there's 4 generations. I'm the babby in that, and there's my dad, my granddad, and my great grandfather. So there's a real sense of belonging and history to it. And when you buy a modern house, say in a modern housing estate, or you keep moving around, you actually lose that connection that's in your blood to the ground and to the land you're in. And there's something very, very important about that. And I think people from rural communities and farmers and things will understand what I'm saying, but it really does tie you to the house, to the land, to the animals on it, and to the life in the village and the community that you're in. And again, that whole community and village and history is something that's fast disappearing from our worlds, and it's not a good thing. That's a very negative thing. I think it's something we all need grounded in some way. We all need a sense of belonging. My parents' generation was a very different generation even to us. They came from a similar type background. You think they were sort of born post-war, and post-war in the UK there was a wee bit of a boom. You had the National Health Service came along, you had the council starting to build houses, which my parents had when they were sort of newly married. They were able to get one of those. There was a wee bit of a sort of a boom going on. They had went through their own sort of liberation and music from the older generation. They had the Beatles, they had Woodstock. For the first time, they were in control of their own sort of, if you want to say, sexuality. Things like divorce and things were coming along for the first time, where before in our communities, no matter what situation you were in your marriage, you had to stay in it. Absolutely. There was no such thing. You had to stay to the end, to death do us part. And when the 1970s came along, there was a real downturn in the UK, and there were very hard times. If any have ever seen a little TV programme called The Boys from the black stuff. There was a guy in it called Yasser Hughes. He used to go around going, "Get a job, get a job." If you didn't give him money, headbutt you. If you look that up and watch that, if you're not familiar with it, it'll really give you a setting, the scene of the social economic downturn there was in the UK and how tough and hard it was for people to actually get by. My father was very lucky with a small farm. Now, it wasn't big. You would call it a hobby farm nowadays, and he was a joiner, and there was always work on the go for him somewhere. So we done all right. My mother was a housewife looking after us. But I know a lot of people that weren't in rural communities, say in the towns, they did struggle for work, and there was a huge amount of unemployment. And then as we went into the late 70s and early 80s, we had all the miners' strikes in the UK and Margaret Thatcher and all the downturn there was with that. And the working communities, literally, we were losing their factories, they were losing their mines, they were losing their way of life and their jobs. And there was a huge amount of social upheaval. And you had these parents who were dealing with all this and they were struggling to get by. And because of that, they brought us up very differently to the ways maybe they had been brought up. As money was tight, your mother, she would have worked out a menu literally for the week. Because we lived in a remote rural area, there was no such thing as nipping around to Tesco's or to the corner shop. So you would have put together a list of all the groceries for the week. And you would have then, and most of it, to be honest, was like flour for baking and ingredients and sort of dry foods and tinned foods, some fresh meat or something like that maybe. And that was set out for the week. We always used to joke that on a Monday you got X, and Wednesday you got Y, etc. The menu just was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. On Sunday you got the big slap up Sunday dinner or whatever. Nothing was ever wasted. If you didn't finish it, you were eating it tomorrow fried up for your breakfast. So you learned to clean your plate, or you'd have got a good clip to the ear if you didn't anyway. But you always done an amazing job with a limited amount of money and a limited amount of resources. You always turned out a really good dinner. As you can see, I grew up not starved. And it was always amazing the food you could make from what you had in the cupboards. But being a rural village and rural community, there was always somebody to get vegetables or potatoes or meat or something from locally if you were stuck anyway and you could get it at the right price. You would buy literally a big sack of potatoes for a couple of pounds or whatever at the time. So we grew up with a very sort of strict childhood in that because we were running a small farm, you were literally got out of bed at first light early in the morning, long before school. I myself had quite a few little animals myself. I had ducks, I had geese, I had peacocks, I had pigs, I had all sorts of a menagerie of animals on the farm. When you were a young kid, you loved it. Plus I had to look after the cows and the sheep that were on the farm. So you'd been up every morning, hail, rain or snow, winter or summer, and you'd been out, you'd have been feeding them, you'd have been moving them around, you'd have been cleaning them out with a grape and filling the wheelbarrow and all the different things that you were doing on the farm. And you'd have done all that, you'd have come in, you'd have got your breakfast, you'd have got washed. And then literally we lived about 3 miles from the main motorway where the bus to the school was. So you'd have to walk 3 miles in your school uniform, school bag on, walking to the bus. Caught the bus and then got yourself to school for 9 o'clock. Always used to amaze me the people that lived nearby the school, 5 minutes away, and they were always late and couldn't make it in. We had a day's work done, washed, cleaned, walked 3 miles, got the bus and still got there on time. So really all that sort of built-in self-discipline to you. It was sort of like being in the army, but you were at home. On the farm, we had a Jersey cow, and there's nothing to beat real milk either. You used to sit in a wee stool, and you would have sat and milked it into a wee wooden pail, and you had to tuck it in to the house. Fresh, warm milk from the cow, non-pasteurised. I totally believe it's more healthy than anything we have today. Sometimes that white stuff you pour from a plastic container, is it milk? It certainly doesn't taste like the milk I grew up with. We also used to make our own country butter. And sometimes I dream about that country butter. You just can't buy anything like that now unless you go to like a wee artisan market somewhere. You used to pour it into the crocks, let it separate, take the cream and the curd apart, put it into the churn. And it used to be a barrel churn. You sat and you put it round and round and round and round and round till your arms literally dropped off. Then you would get the whey and you would have 2 wooden platters and you would batter it back and forward, getting it into shape. You would get into the shape of a wee butter block, and then with a wee mould, which had like a wee animal symbol, and you would stamp it in the top. You put it into greaseproof paper, and that was your butter. And it was so rich and so creamy, and it was bright yellow because it was made from Jersey milk, etc. That was fresh, nothing added to it. Sometimes you would add salt, sometimes it'd be unsalted if you wanted to have some for bacon or whatever. But you just can't buy butter like that now. Butter now literally is white. It's not even yellow. I don't even know what it is. It's probably plastic. But it's always a memory that sticks with me, is that butter. It was totally amazing. In our generation, we're sort of called the latchkey kid. More so maybe in the towns or in the countryside, because in the countryside usually you had your mother who was the country farm wife, if you want to say, and she'd have been there. But she would have been busy. But in the towns and stuff, Literally, both parents, for the first time, this had never happened before, usually had to go out to work. So both parents would be out of the house, especially during the 70s when things were very tight. Any job you could get, your mother maybe had one or two little part-time jobs, and your dad, if he's lucky, was out working somewhere or out looking for work. So you would have got yourself up, you would have got yourself out to school. When you came back from school, you had to come back yourself to an empty house. You had to let yourself in. You literally had to go and make your own food. So if you knew how to cook and put something together, but to be honest, you're a kid, come on, you got the noodles out, the tin of beans, fish fingers, something like that. You made something quick. You popped it into you, but literally you had to learn to take care of yourself. You'd sort out doing your own homework, sort your clothes out for the next day, do whatever chores you had to do. But very much you were on your own. Your parents maybe came back in later on when they finished their work 6, 7 o'clock and in. But coming home from school's finished about 3 o'clock, you were probably on your own for 3 or 4 hours. And that's where the term latchkey kids comes from. As money was tight, and especially in the farming community, you were always taught how to make money. And it's something I'm very happy about that I did learn in my life. There was no such thing as pocket money in our house. If you wanted to earn your keep in the house, first of all, you had a load of chores to do. So you had to get up in the morning, you had to look after the animals, you had to cut the grass, do whatever, a million little things, chop all the sticks, bring them in, clean the fire out, take all the ashes out. You had those to do, and that you were expected to do that. You were just helping your mum and dad out, and that was covering your keep in the house. So if you wanted anything at all, you literally had to earn the money elsewhere, and that usually meant in somebody else's farm. You'd have went down the road at a young age, you would have went into somebody, you would have went to the milking parlour, you would have milked their cows. Now, it wouldn't have been by hand then, it was a big dairy farm, you'd have put all the different milking things on the cow's udder. Or you would have drove a tractor around, you'd have brought the silage in. But during the autumn time when the potatoes basically were ready, all the small kids literally took about a week or 2 weeks off school, and there was sort of a blind eye turned to it because the community, especially the farming community, needed the labour. I know we've had a lot of immigrants come in, we've had a lot of good hard Polish and Latvian people come in modern days that do a lot of agricultural work, but back then there was none. And do you know who it was? It was the small kids, it was child labour. I have a really bad back in life now, and I always blame it on gathering the potatoes. Literally, you'd have been going up the field, and usually they were really quite muddy and wet fields. Your Wellingtons would have been sticking in the ground. Wee Massey Ferguson tractor would have been up in front of you, and it would have been spinning the potatoes out of the ground with these things that spun round, and you followed it with a big basket, sort of a washing basket that your mother would use, and you'd be gathering up the potatoes into it, bent over for hours putting it in. Because the ground was wet and muddy, the basket used to build up with mud, and it kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier, and you had to keep cleaning it out with an old stone or something every now and then. Basket was full, you took it to bags. There were linen bags back then, or sort of flax type bags. You would put them in, hemp is the word I was looking for. You'd tip them in, and you'd have to keep filling it up. And then you'd have lines of them, and you would walk along the lines filling them up, and the further up it got, the harder and harder it was to put them in. And then you would gather them up into groups. As the years went on, they done away with the bags because they got wet and heavy and were an absolute terrible thing to work with. And they put big wooden boxes out. So you'd fill your basket, you'd run to the wooden box, tip them in. But the thing is, they were well spaced out, and you ended up running back and forward and back and forward and back and forward because they were sort of ton boxes that would hold a ton of potatoes. With the bags, at least you could paste them out through the drills. That was really hard work. And again, at the silage time, when all the silage cuts were been done, you've been driving tractors, drawing trailers. You'd have driven up alongside the guy cutting the grass. He would have put it all in. You'd have driven off into the farm, up to the silo, tipped it out and back. And see, when you were a teenage boy, that was absolutely brilliant. You were driving these big, massive tractors, big trailers. Sure, you thought you were the boyo. You know, could you imagine kids nowadays been told they're going out to gather potatoes into baskets and they were going to go up and down all day? I can remember going over to the ditch and literally drinking water because I forgot to bring my water bag or something with me, or my water bottle and my food. And there were such hot days, literally, you just knew to get like a reed, stick it in through the top so it wasn't dirty, and just drink water out of the ditch. Or if you're lucky, you could find a kettle trough that had water. You could put the ball cock down and get water in your hand. They were tough days. Usually we would have brought sandwiches with us and a flask of tea or whatever, but you know, sometimes you're rushing out, you just forgot. But you made do, and we were hardy enough to realise, like, just do what you have to do and get on with it, because that was the only money you were ever getting, cash. And if you wanted like a new bicycle, like I was looking at a Raleigh Burner BMX, you went and you done the work and you stuck at it, because at home you weren't getting any cash. And that's one of the most important lessons I think I ever learnt in life, was self-reliance. And that self-reliance has really shaped Gen X into who and what we are. When you're small kids, we used to run riot all around the place, and you'd run into the house and your mother was always shouting at you, get out, go and play. And if you didn't get out through the door sharp, you should have picked up the wooden spoon. And everybody in my generation, you either got the wooden spoon on the backside or you got a wet tea cloth. I'm telling you, the wet tea cloth gave you some sting when it hit you. But there was sort of a running joke. We all thought as children our names was get out, because every time you came into the house your mother was busy or they were doing something. They just wanted you out of the house and out of the way, and maybe there were other small kids that were screaming the place down they're wanting to look after. And if you were bigger, you're always told, go out and play, go play with the traffic, all that sort of stuff, or go and find something to do. So you sort of grew up sort of looking after yourself, and you spent a lot of time on your own, and you learned a great thing called your imagination. And in some ways you would have built an imaginary world around yourself. Because you'd worked on the farm and you'd worked other jobs everywhere, you knew how to make everything. We had an old cottage on the farm which was, say, belonged to a previous generation. It was now called the boiler house. And the boiler house inside was just a wee cottage. It had an open fire with, you know, one of those sort of cranes under a crook and a kettle hanging on in the fireplace. But it had always been used as the place to boil up the potatoes and the vegetables to feed to the kettle. And there was a machine for grinding up turnips and corn and loads of old stuff from the Victorian era, if you want to say, or the 1920s, all in there. But there was a big old wooden workbench and it was full of tools and big old fashioned vice on it. This just became my playhouse. I just went in there. One of the things you learnt, and I was fascinated by, was taking things apart. So if there'd been any old piece of equipment, any old electrical thing like a radio or anything that was broken, I loved going in, get the screwdriver out, take it apart, pull it apart, see if how it worked, see if I could fix it, see if it getting working again. You absolutely loved if you could pick up an old washing machine on the side of the road somewhere. I loved taking those back because there was loads of little motors in it. I used to take the motors out and make little motorized cars and things, but you just learnt so many skills on how to occupy yourself and how to have hobbies and how to train and educate yourself, that self-reliance, and it kept you out of the feet and the way of everybody else. No such thing as a gym back then, well, not out in the countryside, so we made our own little gym sort of outside in the yard, and we got like an old car axle with 2 tires on it. We used to sit and, you know, press away with it. We got loads of cuttings of tree trunk into different block sizes for different weights. We'd nail a bit of rope for a handle on, you would sit and you would use them like dumbbells. It was amazing, literally, the sort of gym you could set you up with just old bits of metal and equipment lying around the farm. And we were always known as the country cubs because we were so strong. Anybody that grew up on a farm in the UK, a young lad, even nowadays today, compared to, as we'd call them, a townie of the same age, you know, you were a man mountain in comparison to them. You would have scared the life out of them. Something I always loved, because when I was in town, your dad would have been into the pub for an hour or whatever, there'd always been a pool table, and I always fancied having my own pool table at home, but obviously I didn't have the money for it. So I always remember I made my own pool table out of an old door, cut pockets in it, put sides on it, and used a satin bed sheet for the cloth. Went and bought a set of pool balls somewhere, and we actually just used brush shafts, and we used to have more fun playing on that old thing than if it had been a real table. And so all the neighbours and the cousins would have come around and would have all messed about on it. You made your own things. Many kids outside the Western world today probably do the exact same, but that's the life we had then. Do you know, we loved it. There was so much enjoyment and satisfaction from actually making like your own pool table or toy or whatever it was, or getting an old broken bicycle and renovating it and getting it working. You know, it meant so much more to you than somebody just buying you something and giving it to you. Back in the 1970s, the weather was very different to what it is now, and it's nothing to do with global warming. I'm old enough now to say that these are just natural cycles that come and go, but back then we had really long, hard winters, and because we lived on a rural farm, it's quite steep and hilly, we used to make our own little sledges, and the snow would have been quite heavy and deep, and we had to sledge down the hills on the little sledges, and it was great outdoors fun. And we made skis and things, and we had a wee 3-wheeler motorbike, like a wee monkey bike type thing, a wee Honda 50, and we used to put a rope on the back of it, put our skis on, somebody would drive, and then you'd come skiing on the back until you coped off or fell off or whatever. It was amazing fun. Snow used to be so bad that the snow used to come up in the road to the top of the hedges, and you couldn't actually see the roads. We used to love that because, one, it was great fun, you about and playing it, but it meant you had at least a week off school. You had no way to get down through it, because if you'd tried to walk through it when you're a small kid, it literally been over your head. There was times it was so bad they actually had to send literally JCB excavators from town and dig the road and dig a track right up to our house to get out. We've been stuck for a number of weeks at that stage, and I think we'd even started to run out of tea in the house. The supplies were thick and thin. Growing up in the countryside, one of the things I learned probably was survival skills, because you learn about life and death, the birds and the bees and everything at a very young age. And we used to spend a lot of time, then people argue this is right and this is wrong, but it's the country way. We were out hunting. I used to have these little ferrets and polecats, and I used to keep them in a little box with wee holes in it. And I used to put the box out over the side, at nets to put over the holes to catch the rabbits, and then put the polecat down. Rabbits come out, catch the rabbit, dispatch it as quick as you could, and then you had rabbits to take home or eat, or to feed to the dogs or do whatever. And then spent a lot of time fishing as well. Used to love fishing. This is where life is really different compared to children nowadays. We'd have left home first thing in the morning, got our breakfast and disappeared out the door. We'd have jumped on our bikes, we'd have met up with our cousins who lived, as the crow flies, not that far, but it was about 3 mile round by the road. And we would have headed off to these old bogs and mosses with these sort of lakes in the middle of them. They were so dangerous. And literally we'd have to went through all the bog and got there, and half the time the reeds were sinking under your weight and the water was coming up with waders and stuff on us, and the water was coming up. And we couldn't half swim or anything, but you got there. And we used to fish for pike and trout and that sort of stuff. You would have took them home and ate them and things like that, so you learned how to gut them and cook them and all that sort of stuff, and how to catch wild animals and how to survive in the wild. I think it's a skill every small child should be taught at a very early age, because you just never know where the world's going or where it may go in the future, because look at all this trouble there is at the minute with wars and things, and there's rumours that there might be war again in Europe. Those skills that we got, Generation X, we are the last people that got a lot of those skills around self-sufficiency, taking care of yourself, not waiting for somebody else to sort the problem out for you. Fix everything, reuse everything, and how to cook, eat and find food if it comes to it, and how to survive without electricity and water and telephone and internet and all those things, and how to find yourself from place A to place B. But as I was saying, you would be out all day long and your parents would never have worried about you. I'm not saying times were better or there was less dangers about. Of course there's always been dangers. You've always heard stories about kidnappings and kids going missing and things like that. But we were brought up very, if you want to say, street savvy. And from a young age we were out interacting with the world, and we learned how to interact with other kids. You'd have went into town on your bicycles and you'd have come up against the cool kids in town, the wee gangs hanging out in the corners, and we were the dumb culchies. We were as tough as nails, sort of socially very quiet. And you would have sort of navigated how to get around those lads and things like that. And it was a very good lesson in life. And again, you'd have been out on your bicycles all day long. You'd have been messing about. And you'd have been running into adults. And you very quickly learned how to deal and interact with adults, and how to judge whether they were good or bad, or how to behave, or how to get on your bike and get the hell out of there as fast as you could. Because half the time we're up to a lot of mischief. So when I see kids nowadays getting a lot of slack for hanging out in street corners and breaking bottles and messing about, something, I understand them. We were feral, we run about, we get up to a lot of hijinks and a lot of mischief, and at the end of the day it done no real harm, and it turned us into the people we were. And sometimes I think nowadays there's too many rules, there's too many regulations, and there's too many people judging. Like as an example, sometimes we had headed off across country, and we would have went from one farm to another for miles and miles, but I went from my town to the next town cross country. By road is 10 miles, by the fields it was about 5, would have been Lurgan. And we'd have crossed maybe through 20, 30 farmers' fields. And something, if they saw you out in their tractor walking, they'd just put their hand up, say hello to you and go on about their business, because you were just little kids playing and messing, and they knew you were up to no good, or you weren't up to no good, should I say, and you were fine, and they let you be. See, nowadays, if you went over somebody's gate into their field, they'd be ringing the police, or they'd be chasing you with a big stick. And I think that's very sad. I know there's a lot of crime, and I know there's a lot of theft, and there's a lot of bad things going on in the world, but we're taking the innocence away from children, and we're taking away that time that they need to grow and develop and explore and see things. We became very possessive about our property, about our land and our possessions. We're not willing to share with anybody, and we're just building walls around ourselves rather than walls to keep people out. We're keeping ourselves in. And I think we need to let go of that a bit and go back to the way we were. Looking back, especially the summer holidays when you've been off for several months during the summertime, We had such an amazing childhood being Gen Xers. Literally, you'd have been kicked out of the house in the morning, you'd have disappeared, and you'd have come in. The golden rule is when the street lights come on, now on the countryside, is when the sun went down, you had to be back home. And your parents would never worried about you. They had enough lot of sort of trust in you, that you had enough savvy about you that you'd keep yourself safe and you keep yourself out of trouble. There was no such thing as having a mobile phone where they could ring and check up with you. They had no Google Maps that we could look up and see where we were. We'd have been miles up country roads and everywhere, and would have always found our way back home again. There was no one checking in on you, seeing what you were up to, keeping an eye on you. They weren't worried about you being dirty or messy. They weren't even worried about have you eaten or anything. You'd went out in the morning, you'd have brought a bottle of drink with you, you'd made a sandwich or two, put them in your coat, or on our bicycles we'd have had a wee bag literally under the saddle. You'd have stuffed a few things into it. You'd have probably tied a fishing rod onto the side of it, and you'd have had your fishing bag with you. You'd had all the kit with you to put in a day's crack or whatever, and you'd meet up with other kids and you'd all head off together and you'd just explore the wilderness. We literally were wild, feral creatures, and we were able to do whatever we wanted. And we got up to a lot of mischief. It used to be in old derelict buildings and old factories and stuff, and we used to go in and explore them and climb up onto the roofs of them and climb up trees. Used to be a wee man lived down the way, and now sure he knew rightly what we're up to, but he used to sit out in his orchard and he'd sit in the chair reading the paper, and he'd have his wee dog with him. We would sort of watch and spy on him and wait until he fell asleep. He always fell asleep reading the paper, and he'd be sitting with the head over and the paper sort of hanging down. And we'd have climbed up, he'd lovely pears, we'd have climbed up the pear tree, and you'd have tucked your jumper into your belt, and you'd have been filling up your jumper with pears or apples or whatever it was, and your mates would have been over the other side of the hedge, and you'd been throwing the apples from the tree, and then maybe you'd have stirred and he'd been reading his paper, and sometimes you get stuck and you had to stay really, really still and hope that his wee dog didn't spot you and sort of give the game away. But, he was a lovely wee old farmer, and I think he knew rightly we were there. And he used to go out and he used to sit in the chair knowing that we were up the tree and we'd be stuck for half an hour or whatever. Then he'd eventually get up and he would dander into the house. But he knew damn rightly what was going on. But something? He didn't mind at all. And, it was a great day's fun. We called it progging the orchard. Today they were ringing the police saying somebody's in stealing my apples. But back then it was just what kids done. When you say to kids nowadays about not having a mobile phone or not having the internet, I think they'd look at you as if you had horns. Like, literally, I can remember if you say wanted to meet up with your mates because there was a barn dance or something on and you hadn't seen them in school, it was off for the summertime, you'd literally, we had no telephone at our house in those days, other farms and people had, but if you want to talk to your mates or set something up, literally you had to keep a pocket full of 10p's, and you used to get on the bicycle and you used to have to cycle a couple of miles down in the village. There was one of those red BT phone boxes. You used to go along, you'd ring the house. The numbers were wee short numbers back then because less people had phones, so you used to know the numbers in your head anyway. You'd ring up and you'd ask to Stevie there and what have you, and say, look, on Friday night you can up to Banbridge and we're going to head out, we'll go to the coach or whatever. And that's the way you done it. And when you were heading out for the night, you'd have literally walked around the villages. From our house, the farm, up to Banbridge was about 6 miles cross country, going round farms, scaring up other lads on the way for a night out. You're maybe talking 8 miles, and you'd have walked the 8 miles, you'd have went to the bar, the disco. We were underage. You'd have been in there was a wee country bar, and he used to sell us a few tins of beer and stuff out sort of the back window type thing. We'd get a few tins, we'd drink them on the way, we'd have a wee night out, and then we'd all walk home in the middle of the night, and we'd be coming back sort of at dark. And as you went along the way up wee country roads that were really quiet, no street lighting, it was all right when there was about 6 years, and then when it got down to 2, or you were the last mile by yourself going up wee country roads, it used to scare the life out of you when you were a kid. You knew you were fine, but you'd hear a wee noise in the hedge and things like that. But sure, it just added to the whole entertainment of the night out. I always remember one night I was coming along a wee country road, and there was me and 2 other lads, and we had just been young teenagers at the time. And there was a woman standing at about 1 in the morning in her nightgown in the middle of the road. She literally was sleepwalking and walked out of her house. We turned this corner and there's a woman in a white nightie standing in the middle of the road. I'm telling you, the hair was standing on the back of my neck because I basically think, oh my God, it's a ghost or whatever. Then we went up a bit closer, got a bit braver and realised, I'll not say her name, who it was. So we sort of shook her, woke her and got her walk back to her house and stuff. But she always remembered that story for years, and we grew up and I bumped into it later in life. We used to have a good laugh about that. But, you know, that was wild crack, as we'd call it, and there'd be all these sort of mad stories that would happen, things that would never happen nowadays to anybody. You would see all these strange things that would just occur on your adventures when you're out exploring. So eventually we got electricity to the house. Now, when I say electricity, it was a diesel generator, so it was out in the shed. So when you came home from school and stuff like that there and it started to get dark, you literally had to go out. You had to hand crank this thing, and it was so hard to crank. And half the times it would have kicked back, it would near broke your arm, but you'd have got the thing started. And it always sticks in my mind the noise it made, because it used to go dump, 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 and go really fast. And then when it got fast enough, you knew it was going, and then the lights would sort of come on weakly and sort of dim on and off, and then you'd have full light. But again, because it was a diesel generator, you'd only run it for a few hours, and then when it was bedtime, you go out, you'd knock it off again. But it made a huge difference to our lives having electricity, because we got then television for the first time. I always remember going to school and somebody said, were you watching Neighbours? And I was going, why would you watch your Neighbours? I didn't realise it was a TV show before we didn't have one. You know, that story's always stuck in my mind, how stupid I looked. Probably they looked at me sideways, said, what's he talking about? I remember too, when we first got our television, my great-grandfather, he loved the horses and stuff like that, but he'd never actually seen horses. He'd never seen a TV, so he'd never seen them on TV. And he came in to watch it in the sort of the wee room with the TV on. I think it was the Grand National, and he came in to watch the Grand National. And you know, he couldn't sit and watch it. He got up and he looked behind the TV and he said, like, how's them wee horses coming down that wire? And we're talking about, you know, in those days it was like an aerial that went into the back of the TV, and he couldn't get his mind around it. How's the horses coming down that wire and showing on that screen there or whatever? And he just thought that's the devil's work, and he went out of the room and just refused to watch it. You know, and it's just amazing. That man had spent his whole life sort of living in the Victoria era. He'd horses on the farm, they'd horse and carts. We would have worked in the fields with them, and we'd have took the hay with the pitchforks, and we'd have made stooks, and then we'd have dried the hay in stooks, and then we'd have manually threw them up onto the horse and cart, and then took them back down to the shed or whatever and stacked them. He'd no running water, he had just the well, he'd no electricity, he'd no telephone. He just lived a simple country life, and these things to him at his age in his 90s, he sort of realised this is a new era coming. And it's not something that he could accept or he wanted even to adopt to. It was just so alien to him. And in some ways, probably was a wee bit alien to me, though I grew up in the town when I was young and I did have memories of it. And at that age, you're able to accept and change. At his age, obviously, you know, you couldn't, and I can't blame him for that. But one of the big things that we didn't have that kids nowadays are so hung up on, and that's sort of fashion. The 1970s, as I said, were very hard times, and we would have worn hand-me-down clothes. Now, because I was the oldest in the family, hand-me-down clothes would have came from other relatives. That would have been older cousins and things like that. And I can always remember wearing jeans, and they'd been turned up maybe 3 times, and then as it grew, they'd have been let down, and you had these little lines where the turnips were. And I remember going to school one day, there was no uniform day or whatever, and I came in wearing these jeans. The knee was out of them and was sort of patched, and there was 3 turn-up lines, and they were really short on me, and they all just took the mick out of me and laughed at me. Yeah, you flying those trousers at half-mast, is the cat dead, and all this sort of stuff. But, you know, it meant nothing to me, fashion. I just wanted clothes that kept me dry. I could run about, do what I want, climb in, get muck from to my ears or whatever, and it didn't even bother me. Most of the summertime I would run around Wellington boots, because like you'd run about outside in the fields and the grass and the muck in the sheds, and would have been away fishing and hunting, and Wellingtons were just the thing you needed to wear, and that was the height of fashion for me, a good pair of green farmers Wellingtons. As we became older teenagers, one of the big things was always to have a car at a very young age, especially when you're in the rural countryside, for it give you freedom and independence, and especially like if you were thinking of chasing the girls and doing all this sort of stuff, you need to have a wee car. So we'd have called ourselves boy racers, because we'd have got all these wee souped up hot hatches like a Golf GTI or something like that there. We'd have souped it up, and we put all the stupidest Go Faster stripes on it and flared the wings out, and we'd had fluffy dice. And you know, when I think about it now, like I used to have this thing called a Mooney, where it was a wee man that sat in the back window, and there used to be a wee pipe came through to the seat with like a wee air ball, and I used to press it, and it used to moon, drop his trousers and flush his bum at whoever was following you. I used to have a fake leg hanging out the back of the boot, and then around the side of the boots with wee plastic fingers and stuff. When you think about it now, like it looked absolutely terrible, and what absolute idiots we were. But you know, you just were the coolest kid in town when you had that. And the nice thing back then was cars were really cheap. We could buy an old banger of a car for 50 quid. We'd go down to the scrapyard, you buy a few parts. I always remember the Peugeot 205, and that Peugeot 205 came with a toolkit. The toolkit had a screwdriver, one of those ones that pulls out. It's a Phillips star head on one side and a flat on the other. You could swap about. It had two spanners. From memory, it was a size 10 and a size 12. And with those three tools, you could literally disassemble the entire car. And it was one of the really good things to learn in life, because we literally used to strip those cars to the ground, rebuild them. We'd get an old wrecked, souped up one in the scrapyard. We'd get the rally seats out of it, or the nice red fleshy carpet. And you'd strip the car out over a weekend, you'd rebuild it, and you'd make it look really cool in your mind or whatever, without having to spend the money on the big flash car. You'd make it look like one of them. But you learned mechanically how to take care of your car, how to change the oil, how to change the water, how to change the spark plugs. If something broke, you learned how to work out what was broke, how to fix it, where to get the parts. I always remember when I worked in a telecommunications company there recently, there was a young lad, well, say young lad, he was in his 30s, and he was sitting ringing the car garage, and he says, "What's wrong? Your car broke down." He says, "I need to change the wiper. It's making a bit of a mess on the window. I need a new wiper blade, and I need to swap the spare tyre from the boot. I need to book it in with the garage." And I was just looking at him with I was just looking at him as if he was mad. I was going, "What do you mean? Go to Halford's, buy a refill or a spare wiper blade, get the jack out and swap it." And I had no idea how to do it. And it really dawned on me that, especially maybe town kids or modern kids, they were never taught these things. And I suppose cars now are becoming so expensive and so complicated that you can't sort of get away with doing the things yourself. Yes, small things like that, of course you can, but he never would have had the childhood I had, where you'd have learned how to do all those things yourself and to be self-sufficient, and it's a great shame. One of the things it taught us was to be really self-sufficient. Like everything that I had ever do in my home, like Donna would give off to me and say, "Look, we'll get somebody in to paint, or we'll get somebody in to change that door, or we'll get somebody to come and fit those curtains." And I just absolutely refused, because literally I was brought up where you'd done all those jobs, and through my life I'd have worked with side jobs on building sites. You'd have worked as a labourer, you'd have helped somebody with plastering, you'd have helped an electrician, you'd have helped a joiner out, whatever. But you learned through the years to do everything yourself, and there's very little about the house. The only thing I won't touch is gas, because obviously you need someone to certify that, but everything else I'm well capable of doing myself, because I learned how to do it through my life. Saves me a fortune. I'm really good at DIY. I'm really good at interior design. Like this wee unit here I made just out of bits and pieces out of the recycling bin, if you want to say, out of IKEA, where they sell all the second-hand stuff. I just put it together myself. Live in a small apartment, so it gives us a wee bit of extra storage. There's lots of underneath cupboards and things all around here. And it doubles up as my little movie studio here, with my camera and things set up in front of me. So literally I can turn my hand to anything. I'm not a tradesperson by any means, but during my life I've just learned how to do everything: joinery, electrics, everything you need to do in your own home. And I learned through my life to not throw things away, which, okay, it's made me in some ways a bit of a hoarder, but if I would have spare parts or a bit of wood or a bit of metal, I'd always go and store it somewhere, because I know there's a wee job for that. And sometime in the next 20 years there will be a wee job for it, and I go, there we go. I'm glad I kept that. I'll go and get it. I'll bend it, refashion it, cut it, shape it, make it into whatever I need. And you learn to be so self-reliant with the childhood that we had. As we became sort of older teenagers, we sort of became very rebellious, if you want to say. We'd grown up with such freedom given to us, where we took care of ourselves and nobody ever questioned us or asked us. As teenagers, we embraced, if you want to say, the late 70s, early 80s, the rave culture, acid house, drugs, ecstasy, heavy drinking, binge drinking. We sort of fell down the path of all of those, because we were sort of very free and liberated, and we took all those things on. Nobody could tell us it was wrong, and we wouldn't accept anybody telling us it was wrong. It was the days also when AIDS came out onto the market, and there was a lot of strain and worries around that as well. And, we embraced that the way we embraced everything else. We just got the hell on with it, because we'd done that all our lives. And we probably all went a wee bit too far with it. And we paid a price maybe in later life, with especially the binge drinking, where we'd have worked hard, worked several jobs. You went out at the weekends. Let's be honest, we probably went out every night of the week. We were living in stressful times. There was a recession just coming out of the end of it and into the next boom, where money was becoming freer and more available. The peace agreement had just happened here in Northern Ireland, and it was a lot safer to be out and about in places you wouldn't normally be out and about. And we all probably just did overdo things a wee bit in our lives. And I'm going to do a video later on about more detail about that and sort of the price we all paid with that. So, in conclusion, my Victorian childhood, if you want to say, had a lot of positives about it. The freedom, the liberty that I had. I was able to explore the wilderness, be in tune with nature, learnt so many good skills that have stood me very good ground throughout my life. The hardships that I went through, if you want to call them hardships, made me hugely resilient. In some ways, I'm made of titanium and I can survive almost anything. But it also came at a very, very high price. Basically, in those early days, I was very quiet and very socially isolated and very shy. So during my time in primary school, here's a wee picture of me at primary school. I'm in the bottom right-hand corner there. Basically, it made me so sort of timid and socially isolated from the lifestyles of the other children. I was a very, very easy target, and I did suffer quite a lot from bullying, and it was a lot of physical bullying throughout my years in primary school. And I just didn't have the social skills and the interaction with other children's skills to be able to fight back and stand up for myself. And it's one of the detrimental things that happened to me through my early childhood. People would see the way I was dressed, the lifestyle I would have, small villages, people would talk and gossip, and they knew the lifestyle I had and that I was living sort of like a wild child, if you want to say. And kids are kids, and they would have preyed on that, and they would have mocked me and slagged me and beat me up and things like that. Even though I was so big and strong, I could have fought back and hammered any of them, but that wasn't my nature. I was a very quiet and timid guy. Now, I hold no ill will against those children. At the end of the day, they're just children, and they were all suffering in their own ways. There were hard times, not just for me, but for everybody. So I learned to forgive them through later life. But what happened to me did shape my life. It did change me, and it did hold me back substantially, especially through my teenage years. During my teenage years, I hadn't learned those social and interaction skills that people normally would have done. I hadn't made all the mistakes, and I was having to make those mistakes and learn those skills on the fly. And it took me very much into my sort of 20s, 30s, if you want to say, to adopt the normal human interaction life skills that we all need. I made huge blunders in my life. I didn't fully understand business and money. I did very well because I was very intelligent and I had great skills that I built up with my Victorian lifestyle, and in some ways I'd done very well. But I also made a huge amount of mistakes. But look, everybody makes mistakes in life. But there were mistakes I probably would have known better. I would have seen them better coming and would have known the consequences of them better in advance if it had had a childhood that was more involved in the modern world. So it does come with huge downside to it, if you want to say. I also, because of the situation I was in and the situation you knew my family and lifestyle was in, I did suffer from institutional abuse at a quite high level, but that's a story for another day. But these things, as much as I look back with my rose-tinted glasses, and I did have a wonderful childhood, it did carry large scars on me, my personality, my self-belief and my confidence. Now, I've turned out all right. I had a long journey in getting there, and I overcome all those things. And looking back, would I change anything? No, I wouldn't. Because I had a wonderful childhood. Take the bad side out of it. I had a magical, mysterious, almost like a Huckleberry Finn Famous Five type adventure of a childhood. And you know, if we could only take the good part of that and mix it with the modern part of it, I think it would be an ideal childhood. But look, nobody's got an ideal childhood. We all carry a cross in life, and as long as we come out the other side a bigger, better and stronger person, that's all that's really important. But as I said a moment ago, it did make me internally that I can literally suffer anything, I can bear anything, and I did go through a major tragedy in life, which I'll not discuss here on this video today. But it was absolutely horrific, and to be honest, for a long time I did fall into a deep depression, and I struggled really hard how to deal with it. The nature of my upbringing meant that I couldn't reach out to people, I couldn't interact with people. I was so used to doing everything myself and dealing with everything myself. That's still part of my nature. I didn't know how to ask for help or to reach out or how to lean on others, and I internalized all the issues and problems that had occurred in my life. Now, sort of to get out of that deep depression that I probably lost a couple of years to, or maybe even longer, I decided to go off and travel the world. And when I was off travelling the world in the southern islands of Mindanao, I run into this community that very much was living the childhood that I had. There's a few wee pictures I'll show you there. They were living in sort of grass huts. They were living out in the jungle. They had no services like water or electricity or the internet or anything like that. So I done a lot of volunteering work, and I helped build schools and housing and bring services to them. I also helped teach them about the internet, how to use a mobile phone, how to take their arts and crafts, and how to be able to set up a little micro business on the internet and things like that, and how to make money using modern technology, and to help them get into the modern world. To be honest, it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. Through my life and everything that happened to me, sometimes you always look for the answers to questions and you can never find the answer to them. Being back in that sort of childhood that I had with another community and helping them through that, it really brought me back to ground. It helped me find myself and who I was, and I actually started to make peace with the life that I'd had. And basically it helped me rediscover myself and made me a better version of the person that I always should have been. And I took great happiness out of helping those people. And it helped remind me that sometimes the simplest things in life is where the truest happiness can be found. And those questions that I'd always been asking and searching for answers to, I actually worked out, a bit like the Matrix, there is no spoon. There is no answers because there is no questions. Sometimes life is about living. Things are the way they are. You can't go back in time. You can't change anything. You hope that you can change the future, but the most important thing is to live in the now. And I think I always thought there were so many people in this world that I would need to forgive. I actually worked out it was myself that I needed to forgive. Because I was internalising everything, not lashing out, not bringing things to a head and not dealing with things, I was carrying everything inside. And it's only when you learn to forgive yourself, then can you forgive others. And as soon as you forgive yourself, you realise you don't need to forgive others, because do you know what? They were probably doing the best that they could at the time, as we all do. There is no answers, there is no questions, and life is about living. And it was a wonderful childhood that I had. Everybody, I'm sure, has their cross to carry when it comes to looking back on their childhood, and they might blame their parents, and they might blame society, or they could blame 101 other things. The important thing is you made it through your childhood. You learned quite a lot on the way, and you hopefully will carry those forward, the good parts of it, and pass them on to the next generation down. So that's all for today. I've probably bent your ear for long enough in this one. So if you happen to like these little stories that I'm bringing to you, please like, share and subscribe, and join me on my next adventure here on YouTube. Thanks for watching.
You have no time to retire